Hello and welcome to session 2 of our virtual learning series. So this is the second session in a series of 6. The first session was very much looking at ideas in the conceptual or the cognitive realm, and today we're moving into more of the self domain or the intrapersonal domain, looking at issues of psychological and physiological resilience. And our first 30 minutes before we get to the second digestive session is going to be led by Karen Ellis. So thank you, Karen, for agreeing to run today's session. I'll hand over to you.
So what I'm going to talk about today are some concepts related to resilience. Obviously, this is a subject that's really come up a lot for people over the last month or so as Europe has been battling with COVID, and we've been learning to live in lockdown, and we're continuing to learn to live in lockdown. And there are lots of good tips out there about how to stay resilient. There's loads of stuff on the web, some of which is good, some of which is not so good, but there's plenty of individual tips about resilience. What I'm going to try and do today, and in the 2 sessions that follow, session 4 and session 6 in the series, is talk more about some overarching concepts of resilience, partly so you can then think about those more deeply for yourselves and start to develop your own resilience repertoire rather than always relying on tips from other people. So we're going to be quite conceptual at the beginning, but then we're going to get into some actual practices, both a physiological set of practices and a particular psychological practice for you to work with on your own, because having a series of practices to manage your mental, emotional and physical state in these times is really important, but they need to be ones that are for you and designed by you. And I'll come back to that at the end. So this character here, who the hell is that? That's a tardigrade. Those of you who remember the news from last year will remember that we managed to put water bears on the moon, and this is a water bear. These critters are about 1/4 of a millimeter long, and they're the most resilient species on the planet. And part of the reason he's our hero today is because he can live in any environment. He can live in steam vents, he can live on the moon, he can actually even live in deep space. So I don't think any of us are going to beat the tardigrade for our resilience, but I thought he'd make a good hero for us. So what we're going to try and do today, as I said, is use a combination of ideas, theory, metaphors, and some exercises to help us understand the concept of resilience and how it applies to humans, introduce an idea called the recovery cycle, which is how you actually recover from shocks, give you a few practices, as I said, and help you to start to think about your own resilience repertoire, which is the set of practices that you use to look after yourself in difficult times. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea. Resilience is a word that gets overused and misused a lot at the moment, and it can sound like what it means is being very, very tough. It means actually something very different. It means the ability to bounce back. It comes from the Latin resilere, which means to jump back or bounce back. And if you look at the difference between this palm tree bending in the wind and the poor old oak tree that's been knocked over by the wind, that's the difference between resilience and toughness. Toughness is the ability to withstand things. Resilience is the ability to take a shock and bounce back. So those of you who are familiar with those amazing martial arts movies with all the special effects will know what a resilient movement pattern looks like, which is very different from the boxer standing his ground and fighting. So this is the formal definition of what resilience is. Resilience is the capacity of people to cope with stress, to bounce back, and to use that stress to improve their resistance to future events. And when I think about resilience, I think about 3 key themes which are linked to it. The first one is the idea of recovery, which we're going to spend most of our time on today. The second thing is the idea of equilibrium and how you maintain a dynamic equilibrium rather than a fixed equilibrium, which we'll talk about more in session 4. And the third theme is the idea of adaptability. So how well can you adapt to different sorts of circumstances and stay resilient in as many different situations as possible. So before I actually go into the content, one of the things I'm going to do is to talk to you about your physical selves just for a minute or two. A lot of us have been sitting glued to our screens and fixing ourselves and fixing our eyes, none of which are very good things for the body. So I want to give you permission at this moment to actually do something different. I want to give you permission to lie down or move around or tidy up or do your yoga. I've got some good slides, but they're not vital, and you'll be able to understand most of what we're working with by listening to my voice. And in fact, I'm actively going to get you to do some stuff physically in about 15 minutes. So I have 2 suggestions for different postures that are actually very good for supporting yourself. Partly because we're all suffering from bad backs from staring at our screens in badly ergonomically designed sitting rooms. So just as I say, you can move around, you can stand up, you can walk about. You'll see that I'm standing up rather than sitting down to do this webinar. But 2 very good positions for recovery and for managing your back in this time are one that's called semi-supine. Mike, you might have to just shout to me and tell me whether you can see me. Are we okay?
We can, Karen. Yep.
Right. So semi-supine is not lying on your back with your legs flat out, because that's actually quite a strain on your back. It's lying down with your legs bent up and your shin bones as vertical as they can go. So if you can see, my knees are above my ankles rather than me being here, which requires me to use my big thigh muscles to hold my legs up. So semi-supine, hands away from bodies, feet flat on the floor, hips relaxed, and knees above ankles. That's a very good resting posture to listen to webinars from. And the other option is a thing called constructive rest, which is an even more relaxing position for your body and particularly for your spine, where you would find yourself a chair with a cushion on, probably, so that your shin bones can be the same, can be horizontal and parallel to the floor. And again, you lie with your bottom as close to the chair as you can, so that your thigh muscles are loose and your legs are at rest. If you do this for 10 to 15 minutes a day, it will provide a huge relief for your spine and get it out of that kind of sitting posture that we're all getting stuck in at the moment. If you Google semi-supine or constructive rest, they'll have more detailed instructions there as well. So get up, move around, stand about, go into a lying down posture, and then I will keep talking to you over the next 15 minutes. Thank you, Mike, for demonstrating. So what's all this stuff about equilibrium? So if we are going to be able to bounce back, we need to know where our equilibrium point is, and that's different from all of us. I use this graphic a lot. It's really just a metaphor, but if you can imagine yourself going along as normal and feeling the way that you normally do, which is a reasonably good equilibrium, when you get a shock, everything goes up in the air, and it's like you'll get subjected to a big wave that's going through your body. Those of you who know the physiological reaction ideas will know that that is the thing that stimulates our fight-flight response. Adrenaline goes up, we get stressed, we bounce around, and then gradually we return to equilibrium. And this is true of physical shocks, like say being shunted in your car, we get that kind of reaction, or psychological shocks, which are often to do with things that are happening with other people, or sudden changes of circumstance like we're all facing at the moment. So when you have a shock, you go out of equilibrium and then you gradually come back over time. Humans are not designed to, like any other living thing, we're not designed to stay perfectly flat all the time. We're always oscillating a bit in our moods, in our physical well-being, but that's different from something really throwing you out. So just to talk about the physiology, you might mention that we're talking about physiology as well as psychology. When we have a trigger event, the body perceives that, it gets our sympathetic nervous system working, which is the one that creates the fight-flight response, either causes us to run away or to get combative, depending on our nature and what the situation is. We get a load of adrenaline, we get a load of cortisol going through our bodies, and we focus. So one of the problems we've all got at the moment is we're all sitting with our eyes focused, watching our webinars and having our video conferences. And actually that's putting us into a stress response quite apart from anything else, which is why I say move around, walk around, get your colleagues to do the same, because the more we sit like this, the more stressed we're all going to feel. Once the stress has passed and we've either run away or we've got into a fight, or we've realized actually it wasn't a saber-toothed tiger, it was just somebody's cat running across the back of the garden, then our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. This is the system that manages most of your day-to-day hormonal and homeostatic functions. It creates a brake on the system. It reduces the adrenaline levels. It allows the oxygen to flow back into your system normally, gets your digestion going, and all that kind of thing. If we keep getting repeated shocks and we don't have time to recover, then what happens over time is our cortisol level stays up all the time, and we never allow it to drop. The adrenaline does go up and down because it's a different sort of neurotransmitter, but cortisol level goes up and up and up. It's associated with inflammatory illness and all sorts of other nasty long-term health conditions. So the long-term effect of stress is often physical or psychological burnout. So that's why we need to think about how quickly we recover from every shock, because if there isn't enough time in recovery, then we will end up in an elevated stress state. So this is a bit of science for those of you who like science, and you can plug your ears if you don't like science. You have a big bit of technology in your own body which works to calm you after a shock, which helps you to recover, and it's called the vagus nerve. So again, if you Google this, there are lots of great books about vagal nerve tone, which is the ability of, is your body's ability to develop its ability to recover and to damp down shocks. So on my little wigglygram, the vagus nerve acts as this damping system. So when you get a shock, it doesn't affect you as much and you recover more quickly. Those of you who have small children will know that the thing that you need to do when they've had a shock is gather them towards you and hold them. What you're actually doing, whether you know it or not, is not just giving them a hug. Because your vagus nerve is such a big nerve, when you put someone else's body against your own vagus nerve, you can use your own vagus nerve to calm theirs. So when you get a little kid and you hold it tight, what you're doing is your body's system is actually calming it down by using the vagus nerve. So we all tend to, well, not all of us, but some of us gravitate towards hugs when we're stressed. And that's partly because we're able to regulate each other using our vagal nerve tone. So it's a really important thing to learn about and find out about if you're that way inclined, but I'm going to give you some exercises which will help with it anyway. So I'm just going to get you to do a little exercise on your own for a minute or two and think about how you've been managing in terms of recovery. So if you think about what's happened over the last month, wherever you are in Europe, might be a different time frame, but the very start of the pandemic response that was affecting you locally, what events have given you personally the biggest shocks to the system? So this may not be a big national event. It may not be, you know, the numbers in the horrible death tolls and that kind of thing. It may not have been actual lockdown itself. It might have been a row with your partner because you're both trying to work from the same living room. It might have been something where you actually went to the supermarket and there really wasn't the stuff that you needed at the point where everybody, well, certainly in the UK, was panic buying. So if you think about one of those events, how would you rate your own coping process? How did you do at managing that individual situation? What strategies did you use to make things work for you and to recover from that? And then also, how might you use your learning from that experience to help you be more dynamic in the future? What's really important about shocks to the system is they're very personal. So if I talk about my own response to the beginning phase of this whole pandemic experience, the thing that I found most difficult personally was not having any data about how the illness actually worked and how it affected the body. Of course, we know a lot more now, but there was very little publicly available data. And I couldn't cope with that. It made me really anxious. My way of dealing with the world is to be a scientist because that's my training. And once I know the data, I calm down. So that's very different from other friends who didn't really care about any of the scientific data. They were just worried about how they were going to get their food deliveries. And that was the thing that was shocking them. So we don't have to think about shocks as really big things that are affecting everybody. They're very personal to us. And our own coping process is very personal to us. And if I was thinking about how I coped with that, it was poor, frankly. So at this moment, in that situation, my coping process was nowhere near what it usually is. And I had to learn from that about what actually affects me and decode that for myself. I hope that makes sense. And it's given you a time to manage that exercise for yourself. So I'm going to talk a bit now about how we bounce back and the importance of recovery, and particularly the importance of recovering properly. Because if you're a tough character, one of the things you often think is, oh, I've recovered now, I need to get on with stuff, and you move on too quickly. We know now from all the research about physical resilience that recovery and as a process is vital to your building your stamina in the long term and building what I call your equilibrium envelope. So the different things that you can cope with, the span of situations that actually you can bounce back from over time. So the more you can absorb, the bigger your equilibrium envelope is, and recovery is vital to use your time and your shocks for learning. So we know this at a physical level. We know that all living creatures have recovery processes. Most living creatures are better at recovering than humans because they don't let their psychology get in the way and tell them to get back to work. So any creature, from the smallest amoeba to this cat recovering its position in the air, to the Fynbosch in South Africa, which is the picture on the right, where the whole thing is designed to follow on from fires, and everything regrows and recovers after a fire. All of those things have a cycle of recovery. What we tend to do as humans is try and shortcut that and go from 0 to 60 in a very short space of time. But we now know from physical training that recovery is really important. So it's all very well doing a HIIT workout, but if you don't give yourself the recovery time during the HIIT workout, actually you don't build any resilience in the long term. These are pictures of semi-supine constructive rest and this young woman having a decent smoothie after her run. Recovery time is key to building muscle tone. It's key to building elasticity. If we just keep training at full pace, we don't actually build any resilience in our bodies at all. We might get very taut and tight, but we don't actually create that elasticity in our bodies. So we've got that idea in physical training. Those of you who are keen on keeping fit and play sports will know how important recovery time is. You don't just keep going all the time. We're less keen on that often in our psychological world, where we think, okay, I'm better now. You know, I've had a nasty reversal, but I need to get back and back to full function. We don't think about that at a psychological level often enough. So I talked about the recovery cycle. This is something that I think about for myself, which is there are 4 real steps to a recovery process. And this is true at the physical level. It's also true at the psychological level as well. So the first thing we need to do when we've had a shock is to regulate ourselves. We need to bring ourselves back as close towards equilibrium as we can, get ourselves out of that first big disturbance and just bring ourselves down. And this is where vagal nerve tone is key. The vagus nerve helps us to regulate ourselves after a shock. We then need to rebalance. So sometimes if we've had a shock, for example, a physiological shock, I don't know if you noticed, but I certainly noticed you get very thirsty. That's because you pumped a load of neurotransmitters and neurochemicals into your blood. And actually your blood needs to be diluted again. So your body says, thirst, we're thirsty. Or it might say, I need sugar now, I need sugar now. And it's really good to follow those hints because they help you to rebalance your chemistry. The same is true when you're thinking psychologically. Thank you, Mike, for demonstrating. I'm going to do the same thing. I get nervous when I'm doing these presentations, so it's really good for me to drink. So rebalancing, we've regulated ourselves. We're trying to now get everything back to how it was when we were in homeostasis or equilibrium. Then we need to reconnect with ourselves or with the world. So often when we've had a shock, either whether we've gone into fight and flight or even something that's caused us to freeze, we might get ourselves back together, but we tend to stay inward for longer than we would normally do. So reconnecting with other people, with our own bodies, if we've had a physical shock, or just with what we were doing before the shock happened is really important, because otherwise, again, we're not really in the system again, we stay outside it as part of the shock response. And then over time, there's a repair process that goes on. So either psychologically, we might need to go and talk to somebody about what's happened to us if it's a severe shock and begin the process of psychological repair, but that's a longer term event. Physiologically, we might need to, get some decent food into us and sort ourselves out. Any of you who've had the virus will know that the repair process is slow. We're taking a long time to recover from it, even if we've had it quite mildly. And I don't know about you if you've had it or not, but certainly for me, what it's meant is I've had to pay quite a lot of focus, more focus than I would normally do on my eating and my nutrition for my body to feel settled again. So when you have a shock, even if it's a psychological shock, it always has a physiological effect. So a lot of us have reasonably good psychological recovery processes, even if they're not very technical. We go and talk to a friend, we sit and write in our journals, but do we have physical practices to help us recover? Physical state is the foundation of your psychology. When your physical chemistry is wrong, your psychology won't be strong. It is your foundational state. There's some evidence now in relation to COVID that it affects mental state, and I certainly had that experience. I was much more anxious and a tad hopeless than I would normally be in my personal equilibrium state. So I knew that I had a virus. I knew it was affecting me. So I didn't necessarily take that as seriously as I might have done, but I certainly felt it as real as any other psychological state. So we always have to know the way that we get ourselves back to our own equilibrium physiologically in order to help our psychology. Because in essence, this young woman is showing us we are just a bunch of chemicals in a skin bag. Sometimes we don't like to think about that, but we are. If our chemical balance is incorrect, if our hormones are out, if we're pumping too much cortisol, if our adrenal glands have gone splat because we've spent too much time in stress, we're not going to be at our best, however much we try and manage ourselves with our language, mind, and our meaning. The chemistry matters. So the question is, do you have practices? Do you have practices that help you to calm yourself down, to detox your body, not just in detox in terms of alcohol, I'll come back to that in a second, and to get yourself back grounded or centered? People use different words for this. And then to repair yourself over time, which is much more to do in physical world with nutrition and sleep and rest and all the things we know about, but we tend not to pay enough attention to in our busy modern lives. So what I'm going to do now is give you 3 short practices to help you calm, detox and ground. They can be done within the space of about 4 minutes. And I strongly recommend every time you have a shock, take yourself through this little cycle and then spend some time on repairing, because it will help you recover. Okay, so the first practice, and there are handouts on these practices on the website, by the way, is calming. So most of us know that actually what the single most calming thing you can do is address your breathing. There's a number of reasons for this, partly obviously because it helps you manage your oxygen and carbon dioxide balance, which is really important. When we panic, we tend to keep too much carbon dioxide in the body, and we don't get rid of it enough, which I'll come back to in a second. But also breathing is important because it fools the vagus nerve. So when your vagus nerve is kicked because your sympathetic nervous system has had a surprise, it makes you breathe shallowly. And you can probably hear that I'm a little bit breathless because I'm nervous about presenting. And actually, if I allow myself to breathe slowly, I can tell the vagus nerve, actually, I'm perfectly calm. The body works in a reflexive way. So we can actually fool our body into thinking we're in a state that we're not actually in, simply by managing our breathing and our attention. So I don't know if you know the research that says if you smile, you're likelier to be happier. It's not just that when you're happy, you tend to smile. The breathing and the vagus nerve work in the same way. If you fool your vagus nerve by breathing more slowly and focusing on the exhale, it is calming for the nerve. So the exercise that really helps with this is a thing called 7-11 breathing. It's not about deep breathing. Deep breathing can actually be disturbing for some people, particularly when they've had a shock, because it can cause you to over-oxygenate and then to hyperventilate, which is not very useful. So we don't ask for a deeper breath, we ask for a slower breath. And 7-11 breathing is an encouragement to focus on the out breath and make the out breath half as long again as the in breath. 7 beats for the in breath, 11 for the out breath. Now, I can't breathe for 7 seconds. No way. So I do a 4-6 breath. You might find yourself doing a 3-7 breath, 3-8 breath perhaps. But the way to manage the exercise is not to try and force yourself to breathe more deeply, but just allow your breathing to slow down, breathe through your nose, do as Mike is demonstrating. So in and create a count, and then extend your out breath for half as many seconds again. So if I breathe in, yes, I'm managing a 4-6 at the moment. So if you just, for a minute, use your own count to breathe in and out. You can close your eyes. Sometimes just looking down and defocusing your eyes work just as well. Some people don't like closing their eyes. They find that makes them panic. So in for your count and out for the count plus half as long again. And you should find that that calms you down after any kind of experience. 7-11 breathing, it's genius. The second thing I'm going to show you is a detox move. So I talked a bit earlier about the various different neurotransmitters that get activated when our sympathetic nervous system takes a hit. Adrenaline and cortisol are important and they're useful, but we don't want them hanging around in the body, particularly adrenaline. So any of you that run or cycle will know actually a really good way of getting over a nasty shock is to go out and do some aerobic exercise. Completely true. And the main reason for that is it does get adrenaline and some of the other hormones, including testosterone, moving in your body and getting them out of the body. So there is not always the opportunity to do that. If someone's been rude to you in a meeting, you can't just say, right, I'm going for a run now. But you can go to the loo and give yourself a bit of a shake. So there's a shaking practice. Again, we have a link to a particular Qigong practice on the website, but there's a very simple one, which I'm going to demonstrate now, which is just wherever you are, you can stand up, give yourself a little jiggle and start to shake your body, starting with your hands, allowing that to move into your arms. You need to do this within your own physical limitations. Obviously, don't damage any bit of you that feels uncomfortable. If you've got dodgy joints, avoid that joint. Don't shake that joint. If you can shake a leg, shake the leg. If you can shake the other leg, shake the leg. And if you want to, you can shake your whole spine and your head. But that's a physical question for you about how resilient and elastic you feel. But the more you give yourself a shake, the more of those hormones and neurotransmitters will move into your bloodstream. Then you need to drink. So it's no good pumping the stuff out of your blood into your bloodstream if you don't then move it onto your kidneys, which is what the drinking thing's about. So I'm going to do that myself now. So a 2-minute shake will actually make you feel a lot better. Any of you who've got pets will know that anytime your dog or cat has had a shock, it will give itself a shake. Because they're doing exactly that same thing naturally. It's just as humans, we've forgotten that that's the right thing to do. So first breathe, then give yourself a shake. Be the mammal that you actually are. And then the next move is to try and ground. Now, the two exercises I gave you at the beginning, semi-supine and constructive rest, are very grounding. But again, you can't always lie down in the office. So another way of grounding yourself is just to bring yourself back into your body. Often when we've had a shock, we fly out of our bodies. We become these sort of persons that are just in our head and chatting to ourselves. And also, you know, if we get to spend too much time sitting at our desk, we can actually forget we have a body at all. So there's a process called patting, which is very useful and helps you to find yourself back into your physical body, to ground yourself there. So the process is, if you hold out one arm, you start on the thumb edge of your body, you pat towards your shoulder, and then you turn and go back down your arm on the index finger edge of your arm. So up the thumb edge, down the index finger edge, up the thumb edge, down the index finger edge. It doesn't have to be too accurate, but this actually follows some of the Chinese meridians. You can do it as gently as you like if you're a sensitive soul, or you can give yourself a really good whack and you go up into the big muscles on the shoulder, which often get very tense in us, and then just let that arm go. Just feel for a second if there's any difference between your arms. I don't know about you, but my left arm now feels longer than my right, which is partly to do with the release of tension, but I can also feel more blood flow. It feels tingly. So I think we better do the other arm. Up that arm, on the thumb edge, down on the index finger edge, up on the thumb edge, down on the index finger edge. One more time and take it right up to the shoulder. Give yourself a pat on the big trapezius muscle up here. Then you can give your chest a little pat, your ribs. Take a loose fist and go up and down your back. Again, the amount of impact you want will depend on you. You have to stay within your own joint ranges. And if you can, and you're flexible enough, you can go down your legs, down the fronts, up the sides, down the middles, up the backs, and finish with a good old beat of your glutes, which tend to hold a lot of strain and stress even when we're not sitting down. Your big fight-flight muscles are mostly your big muscles of your legs and your backside, and they can get very tight when we're stressed. So what I like to do is give myself a good old tap. Then I feel much more in myself and in my body, and I feel like an alive thing rather than just a walking brain, which is what we can feel like in times like that. Then obviously, in a physical sense, we move on to the repair, get a decent night's sleep, try not to have too much alcohol, eat decent food. You know all the stuff. It's just a question of making yourself do it. So 3 practices: breathing, shaking, tapping. All of those will help you to bring yourself back into your body after a shock. So that's all very well on the physiological level. As humans, we spend a lot of time in our language minds, which are not the same as our physiological minds at all. And managing your own internal dialogue is absolutely vital when you've been upset. It's very common for us to go into rumination, to go into frustration and trying to fix, to be thinking of all of the things that we would have liked to say when we got the shock but never did, which is called, the French have a term for, which is l'esprit d'escalier, which is the spirit of the staircase. Just as you're leaving the room and going down the stairs, you think of exactly what you should say. But what I'd like to encourage you to do is to think about how you deal with an upset, not by doing any of those things, which can take up a huge amount of mental space. So it's a recovery cycle for the psychological as well. We talked about the 4 R's as the overall process. I use different words for the psychological process. The first thing we have to do, as we do with the physiological, is get ourselves calm. So if you think about something that's upset you in the last month, it doesn't have to be a big thing, because it could, again, as I say, have been an argument with a friend, a difficulty with a colleague, a sudden realization that all your work has fallen away, which might be quite a big upset, so maybe don't choose that one. Then think about how you calmed yourself down after that. It is an important part of a psychological process. We get ourselves calm. Hopefully we don't just react. Sometimes reaction is the right thing, but often it's not. We get ourselves calm, and then we need to detach ourselves from the situation. We need to take a step back and think about the situation from what we call an observer perspective. We need to actually decode and de-stress some of the emotional content and stand back and look at it with a more dispassionate eye. Then we need a process for decoding. So those of you who've come across practices from CBT and NLP will know that a lot of what those technologies do is help us to decode what's happened to ourselves, get us out of our emotional response, and think about what needs to happen next. That's what I call decoding. And then we often need to do something. So once we've had a shock and we've detached ourselves and we've worked out what it was that's really affected us, we often need to then get into communication with somebody or do something as a response. That's very different from reacting, which is just, I've had a shock, I'm going to react. I'm going to just not create any gap between the stimulus and the response. So one very simple decode practice is what I'm going to talk to you about now. Often when we've had a shock, the thing that really bothers us psychologically is the fact that we've got stopped. Now, most people don't ever think about this. When we think about a trigger event, we tend to tell ourselves the story. He did this and I did that, and that was so unreasonable of him. And then I had to do this and I was trying to do the right thing. And he, we get into these huge elaborate stories and they can be very long. And when we talk to other people, we tend to talk to them about the story. But a very different way of thinking about it is to think about, what was it that got stopped? What was it that happened that you were going along, you're getting on with your life in the way that you expected to get on, everything was going fine, and then you suddenly got stopped. So there's a degree of truth in the idea that lockdown has been just a massive stopped process. We're all in a stop process at the moment. Our businesses have stopped, our plans for our children have stopped, our holidays have stopped. All sorts of things have happened to us that mean that we can't move forward. But if we can work out exactly what was stopped in an upset, we can find an alternative way to move forward. And the thing to do is to work out what was stopped. Stoppages fall into 3 categories. So what I'm going to ask you to do for a couple of minutes is think about something that caused you an upset, so a trigger event for you. Note down what happened, make a little note to yourself. Only write the facts, not the interpretations. This is what actually happened in the situation. I was having a conversation and this person said this, and that's what triggered me. Or I was trying to make something happen and I couldn't make it happen. Couldn't get the shopping I wanted. Now I don't know what to have for dinner. There are 3 types of stoppage. One is something we can't do, which is a thwarted intention. I'll come back to who originated this in a second. Something we can't say, which is an undelivered communication, or a need that didn't get met. So we had an expectation that was not fulfilled, and these are usually interpersonal. I needed someone to look after the house for me while I was well. And when I came back and I recovered, the house was a complete bomb site because nobody had done that. That's the kind of unfulfilled expectation. These ideas are adapted from work by Werner Erhard, who is both famous and notorious for his work that resulted in the practice called EST, and also for the foundation of what's called landmark education. There are some great technologies in the landmark education technologies, and this is one of them. This is where I learned it from. So 3 types of stoppage: something you can't do, something you can't say, or a need that can't get met. So if you think about the thing that triggered you and just think about what thing got stopped in that process, maybe make a note of that for yourself, and then think, how might you do it anyway? Okay, your business has come to a stop. What might you do that's actually productive and might lead you to earn some money again in the future that you can use this time for? If it was something you can't say, how can you say it in a better way? If somebody's upset you, how might you deliver a communication that actually is good and connecting for the two of you rather than just a blame or a criticism? And if someone has failed to meet your needs, how might you meet those needs yourself? How could you get them met in another way? If you really need support and your best friend is not a very supportive person, it is instead just continually challenging you, what friend do you have that actually is a good supporter so that you can go and have a conversation that meets those needs? So if you can, every time you have an upset, think about what got stopped, it gets you out of story, it gets you out of the emotional response, and it allows you to move on in a different sort of way from the one that actually got prevented at the time. So that's one bit of psychological recovery. There are loads of other techniques. I'm sure you all have come across them in whatever technologies you work with, but they all follow the same pattern. They help us calm ourselves down. They help us detach from the situation, take a step back. They help us decode what's happened in our own unique way. And then they help us enact a solution in a way that is more measured and not just a reaction. So 2 sets of recovery processes, one set for your body, breathe, shake, tap, repair, and then one for your psychology after a trigger, which is to look at the stop process and work out how to do it in a different way. So that's all I'm going to cover for today. Next week, or the week after next, in a fortnight's time, in session 4, we'll talk about relationship resilience, and I'll particularly focus in that session on the idea of dynamic equilibrium, how you actually stay in an equilibrium position with somebody or some people that you're in relationship with. And we'll talk more about that idea then. Okay, so I'm going to close now. Say thank you to Mike for patiently listening to me and being my audience and doing the exercises. In a short while, Julie Allen will take over with her Digestive.
Thank you very much, Karen. And as Karen said, stay on if you can for Julie Allen and her Digestive. In the next session in the series, we're back to looking at a conceptual or more cognitive aspect of dealing with complexity in current times, where we look at complex or non-linear causality. And Karen will be back for session 4, as she's just mentioned, looking at relational resilience. So
thanks very much, Karen, for lovely exercises and reflection around resilience. And this is now our part 2, our digestive sort of piece, where we take a slightly different take on things and I don't know, settle with them a different way, enable a bit of integration differently as we go about our lives. And it's usually about 20 minutes long. And today, as the slide says, we're going to be present. And then it's about being courageous and a bit about being known. Being present is just simply the pause point that we tend to do at the beginning of these digestives, just to settle. It's not about meditation today. We are talking about the still point of the turning world, as the next slide says. There the dance is. That's a T.S. Eliot quote. So the simplest way just to reconnect and get our system on board is with the breathing. And as Karen said, the principle is that you breathe out for longer than you breathe in, about half as much again. So there's a 7-11. Today I'm going to use 4 and a 6. If 4 and a 6 doesn't suit you, then just the principle of it would be fine, because it's tricky, especially if you've got any issues with your breathing. So just a quick pause to do the 4 and settle nicely in your chair and breathe in for 4 And out for 6. And in for 4. And for 6. And do another one. And as you do that, if you don't need to use your tongue for talking, you can just rest it at the bottom of your mouth and feel your jaw go relax. Just manage to feel how your 2 lips touch each other. And sometimes it's nice to put your hands on the top of your legs and just feel the touch of the skin. There's a lot of information comes in through our skin. We don't always pay attention to it. We think about the muscles and so forth, but just that nice feeling of skin, of you touching and feeling those sensations, and just having a breath now as it suits you to do so. And you can come back to the 4 and the 6 anytime during the session that you like, and anytime during the day or the week that you like. So we've been attending to our bodies and how to understand and augment our ability to bounce back and be resilient. The content today, I'm going to partner that with some noticing about courageousness, building on some of what we did last week, which this slide here is about. You don't have to have been here last week, and indeed you can check out the YouTube video for it. We built on Roger Steer's work, excellent springboard from my colleague Roger, who is a corporate philosopher. And we spoke about the ethics of obedience and reason and care. And the ethic of obedience is sort of to do with compliance and legal rights and duties, that sort of organisation you might come across. And actions come from fear sometimes, and we might stop thinking for ourselves under those circumstances, or maybe we become rule breakers and dial down our creativity in other ways. The ethic of reason, about rational judgment and prudence and self-control. And that can work in some ways, as can each of these different sorts of ethics. But if we feel like we need all the different facts in order to make a decision, we might find ourselves struggling a bit. And the ethic of care, which is more to do with our sense of the benefit that we can have for as many people as possible, and harm for as few as possible. And the only downside with that, really, well, one of the problems could be that there's always a few, and so minorities can feel excluded. We may think that the outcome is worth any sacrifice, and we might just get happy with feeling very happy and content with things, even if it's not optimal, or even a good situation if we're being a bit more objective. And when you look at those in terms of the mix between work, which is those red columns on the right, and life, which is blue, you might not split things that way, but in the questionnaire that Roger used, he asked people to make that choice. And you can see that the ethic of obedience red bar is rather high compared to the blue for life. And then in the middle there, you've got the ethic of care, where the red is sort of dipping down below that middle point of 50, which the blue line is hovering close to. And again, you can see ethic of reason is a little bit same pattern as the larger red than blue. The 10 virtues that we looked at, the first 4 there, wisdom, fairness, courage and self-control, are the words Roger's using to refer to the 4 Greek virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude and temperance. Then there are 3, faith, hope and charity. You might recognise, if you're familiar with the Christian tradition. Other faith traditions have those equivalents. Trust, hope and love is how Roger has labelled those. And then 3 that he felt were quite pertinent to modern times, if you like, and people recognised, of honesty and humility and excellence. And so today I'm going to draw attention in the next slide to the trajectories of courage and love and humility. But if you just look at this chart here, which is the one where the 10 virtues were split across different organisational levels, self-reported by those who filled in the questionnaire. And you can see that on the right-hand side there, courage is the one that is at the top, and that's at the board level. And then at the bottom at board level, you can see there's love, and that one right at the bottom is humility. And the other thing that I thought was interesting about this is the general trajectory of them. So if you see employee over at the left-hand side there, then the trajectory of courage goes from sort of bottom left to top right, whereas the trajectories for love and humility are on the whole doing it the other way around. So let's have a little thought about courage, and the encourage, and the title of this slide is to do with the French word for heart. And as resilience is not about toughing it out, courage is not about gung-ho rushing in. Roger's definition here was it's about grit and determination, but you don't want it to tip into being stubborn. With love, there was compassion and generosity, but on the other hand, you don't want it to tip into something like obsession, infatuation. And with humility, there's the modesty, but on the other hand, false modesty might not be useful for us either, or the opposite, arrogance. But thinking in particular about what courage might be, have a little think. I mean, what would it look like? What do you think courage is useful in service of? What would it look like if it also held a space for the love and the humility, rather than them being so spaced out like that? And when we originally did the recording of this, we did have a chat box available, and we asked people about these definitions, and thinking about where they see it, and thinking about, 10% more courage, what would it take to do that? And people were really liking this idea that courage is to do with speaking from the heart. It's heartfelt. We got quite a lot of appreciation for that thought. And Lindsay said, if you can be courageous in how you encounter the unknowns inherent in the current crisis, that could resource you in significant ways. And there was some agreement with that as well, and acting in service of values. And Aristotle there, he said, courage is the first of human qualities because it's the one that guarantees the others. So if we can bring that courage and the speaking from the heart, then that's a support for these times, I think, and for any other times people were saying about being able to act even when you're fearful, and courage rising above fear. And I think in these times, it's useful to think not just of the sort of courage that goes out and about, but we have the sort of courage that is keeping us closer to home as well. So many different sorts of call for considering the heart and how we might use that sort of courage. At the same time, on that slide, there's a little thing there that says there's many a slip twixt cup and lip. And so hopefully the practices from part one will help you, because the thing about courage is you first need to notice that there's a need for it, and then you need to decide to do something about it, and then you need to decide what it is that you can do, and then you need to take some action, and then you have to be kind of okay with whatever it was you did or chose not to do. So that is really quite a process to ask of ourselves. And so at each point, it's worth considering how we can be resourced and what it might take us to perhaps be, just 10% more courageous in what we're doing, and think to ourselves, okay, well, in organizational context or life context, when might just another 10% of heartfelt courage serve as well? There's a reference there to ethicability for those of you who are interested, as well as being able to fill in the moral DNA questionnaire that we spoke about last week. You'll also find a link to Roger's ethicability work, and he's giving that away free at the moment. So that's a lovely resource to have a look at all the different ways in which you might support yourself, as he calls it, to do the right thing, which is to know what that is and to have the courage to take it forward. So that's all I have for you today, except for to say we're going to close with a poem, as I always do, which I hope is an encouragement as you go forward into the world. And because, we need other people. I think there's something about needing other people. And so in the spirit of general encouragement, and recalling we're not alone, and what we perhaps want others to see in us. I'm going to read today a poem by Jo Bell called Kith, and I will read it twice, once for the words and once to let the meaning settle. And kith's an old word. You might have come across kith and kin as an expression where kin are the people you're related to, and kith is kind of like that, but a bit like people you choose to have around you, your people if you like. Kith. A word made scant by frequent use. I like it for its urgency and spit, for its necessity. I like it for its oldness, for its slingshot certainty. I like it for its plainness, for belonging to the northern tongue behind my teeth. I like it for its fighting talk, the known, the tribe, something I can recognize, something that recognizes me. I am not who I think I am, but who you know me to be. Kith. A word made scant by frequent use. I like it for its urgency and spit, for its necessity. I like it for its oldness, for its slingshot certainty. I like it for its plainness, for belonging to the northern tongue behind my teeth. I like it for its fighting talk, the known, the tribe, something I can recognize, something that recognizes me. I am not who I think I am, but who you know me to be. Thank you. Hope you join us for our third in the series. Bye for now.